Hi, this is David at TED-IELTS, the place to go for honest, reliable IELTS advice. Today I want to tell you about a really difficult question that once appeared in the IELTS writing exam. In fact, I would confidently say that this was the most difficult IELTS question ever. That may be a bold claim, but I have some evidence to back it up. So keep watching if you want to find out what this question is and, more importantly, how you could answer it, or, for that matter, any other difficult IELTS question. If you are impatient and want to skip ahead, then please feel free to do so. I've divided this video into chapters, which you can see down below. Just jump ahead if you don't have time to watch the whole thing. However, I do recommend sticking around. You'll get much more value if you listen to everything. Also, you can see that I have added subtitles. If you have trouble understanding me, then you should turn those on. Okay, let's jump into our lesson. So let's begin with the question that has probably enticed you to click on this video. Drum roll, please. A person's worth nowadays seems to be judged according to social status and material possessions. Old-fashioned values such as honor, kindness, and trust no longer seem important. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this opinion? What makes this question so difficult? It looks easy, right? Well, that's precisely the problem. This question looks pretty straightforward, but that's because people tend to overlook certain aspects of it. In my IELTS writing correction service, which I'll link to down below, students often try to answer this question and about 90% of them get it completely wrong. They read it and come to a conclusion that is asking them for their opinion of whether old-fashioned values or material status is more important. However, this is not what the question asks. If you read it carefully, you will see that it asks you to do something totally different. So let's analyze the question carefully, which is what you should always do before writing your Task 2 essay. First of all, let's identify the key details. A person's worth, social status, material possessions, old-fashioned values, agree and disagree. Looking at this, it's easy to see why people come to the wrong conclusion. That's because, although these certainly appear to be the main content words and question words, we've actually missed the most important parts. A person's worth nowadays seems to be judged according to social status, while old-fashioned values no longer seem important. The question is not asking you whether you agree that material values are more important than old-fashioned ones, but rather whether it seems that they are considered more important. Let's rephrase this in order to understand it better. We could say, to what extent do you agree, disagree that society nowadays deems social status and wealth as more important than traditional values? The two important aspects are, it is about what society thinks of these values, and it is about changing values over time. If you fail to recognize either of these points when reading the question, you would not be able to give a good answer. So imagine you had quickly begun writing an essay about materialistic values and them not being as important as honor and trust and kindness. What do you think your score would be for task achievement? You'd probably score about band 3 or 4, depending upon what you exactly said. This would obviously be disastrous for your overall writing score. So let's take a couple of minutes to explore what makes this question so difficult, because by examining that, we can perhaps give ourselves a better chance of avoiding the same mistake. You probably won't see the same question repeated in your next writing exam, but you might encounter others of a similar nature. When we first look at an IELTS question, we need to analyze it. That means looking for question words such as advantage and disadvantage, agree and disagree, or discuss both views, and so on. This will tell us what we have to do with the statement that comes first. We should look at the keywords in the statement too. Doing this can help us to decipher the question, but we should not make assumptions too quickly. While some questions are straightforward, others have slightly difficult elements. It is easy to see a few keywords and assume that we know what the question is about, but remember that IELTS is a pretty advanced English test and also requires some thinking skills. The problem with the question that we have looked at today is that the keywords did not give us a complete understanding of the question. They seldom do, in fact, but at least they normally tell us enough to basically understand what we have to do. Here, however, they introduced only part of the question and not the most important part. Keywords are normally nouns and sometimes verbs that convey a main idea. When you see words and phrases like climate change and pollution, you quickly get an idea of the subject. Here, however, it was not so obvious. The main verb of both sentences was a small word, seem. Such a word is easily overlooked. It feels unimportant compared to the content words like social status and values. Even when we start looking at other words for a closer understanding of this statement, we tend to see words like old-fashioned and material possessions. The word seem appears trivial at first glance, and amidst the stress of an exam, it would be easy to think, okay, this is about old-fashioned values versus new ones. Indeed, the idea of old versus new is quite common in IELTS, and so it's a reasonable assumption that you would be asked to write an essay about whether you agree that some values are outdated. But perhaps there is another clue as to why this is not the full question. The premise is just too simplistic. Think about the real IELTS questions that you have read, the ones in the Cambridge IELTS book or in your last test. Did they ever ask you such basic questions? It's like asking someone, it's better to have a warm bath than be eaten alive by sharks. To what extent do you agree or disagree? You would never be asked something that only has one realistic answer. Thus, you would not be asked whether it's better to be an honest, decent, kind human being or a materialistic person obsessed with social status. Indeed, you're going to be asked something that has nuance, that is more difficult to answer. IELTS is challenging, and so these questions will challenge you. Here you're asked whether society views material possessions as more important than old-fashioned values, and that's precisely what makes it possible to write a full and interesting essay. It's a difficult question to answer. You could, in fact, write a very good essay that agrees, or you could write a very good essay that disagrees with it. Let's briefly look at some of the ways people get this question wrong. By now you hopefully understand what you should and shouldn't write as a general response to the question. But let's look at some concrete examples of what not to do. I'll show you the right way to approach it in just a minute. For my IELTS writing correction service, I've read thousands of essays and I leave very detailed feedback. But when it comes to questions like this, I just need to look at the first and last paragraph to know whether the person, the candidate, has understood the question or not. In this example, you can see the candidate has not understood the question at all. She has written, "There are those who argue that it is reasonable to judge a person by his social and economic position in a society instead of good qualities such as kindness in his character. Personally, I mostly disagree with this view, and this essay will argue why those so-called old-fashioned values are still significant nowadays." So what is she disagreeing with? She has said that she disagrees with the fact that it is reasonable to judge a person by his social and economic position. This is not the same as disagreeing that society judges a person by his social and economic position. It is just giving her personal opinion on the issue of materialistic versus old-fashioned values. The only positive here is that she said old-fashioned values are still significant nowadays, which suggests that she will discuss the question properly in the body of the essay, but she does not. She devotes one paragraph to the reasons why it is reasonable to judge a person by materialistic standards, and another why it is not reasonable to do this. Her conclusion, though, makes it very clear that she did not understand the question. And this is important because oftentimes people actually forget the question while they're writing their essay. Sometimes they start by correctly interpreting it, then become misguided along the way and write different things. In this case, though, she seems to have misunderstood from the start right through to the finish, and so she wrote, "I believe we should emphasize the importance of people's inner beauty rather than status or property when we need to form opinions about other people." All this tells me is her opinion on superficial and authentic values, which really is not important here. An essay like this would simply not fulfill almost any of the criteria for task achievement. Right, we've talked for long enough about what not to do, so let's move on to a more positive perspective and discuss how we can answer this question intelligently. Hopefully, if you've watched the whole video so far, you will be aware of the full meaning of the question, which is the most important thing. Thus, we must first decide what our opinion is and then formulate a good structure. I always choose a 4-paragraph structure for my essays, and I strongly recommend that you do the same. If you want to know why, you can watch the video that's linked up in the top right corner here. My perspective on this issue is that it is probably not true that society values material possessions and social status more than it used to. I feel that this attitude has pervaded human societies for a long time, and that it is naive to say it is a modern phenomenon. So I would like to structure my essay like this. My introduction would explain the issue, but without paraphrasing exactly, and then give my perspective, which is that it is unlikely that people are more materialistic nowadays. If you want to show your thinking and language skills, it is good to avoid being overly certain and to use careful hedging language. In my body paragraphs, I will take a simple approach. First of all, I will explain why it does seem like we're more materialistic nowadays. This may seem contradictory, but as long as you make it clear that it is what other people think, then it's okay. Next, I will comprehensively refute this with my 3rd paragraph, showing how ancient kings and queens were worshipped for their lavish lifestyles, while nowadays people are often commended for charitable and kind acts. This shows that the premise stated in the question is not 100% true. I will then give a conclusion that basically summarizes all of this. If you're still watching, you might be interested in seeing my sample answer. I'll leave a link to a Word document where you can read the whole essay in your own time, but let's look at it here. For my introduction, I would say, there are numerous ways in which a person can be valued, and these vary widely from culture to culture. They also vary over time, and some people suggest that in the modern era, it is more common for people to be judged according to their wealth, rather than their personality attributes. This essay will argue that it is probably not true. So here I've explained the issue clearly and then given my perspective. This is really important, but you must also be consistent throughout the rest of the essay. For paragraph 2, I would say, looking around, it is easy to see why someone might claim that people are increasingly judged by their material possessions. One just has to look at social media such as Instagram to see how expensive possessions can equate to popularity. Young people aspire to have fast cars and designer clothes so they can appear wealthy and gain the attention of others, building large online followings. You don't need to give a balanced viewpoint, but sometimes it is good to show the other side of the argument in order to disagree with it. Here I have said why it is reasonable that people might think we're now more materialistic, and I will refute it in the next paragraph. I've given some good examples to make this perspective believable, showing that the situation is not entirely one-sided. However, is this a modern phenomenon? It seems unlikely. In ancient eras, it was kings and queens who were revered by the wider society. They were not necessarily loved for their honor and wisdom. Mostly they were adored for their wealth and power. People wanted to emulate them, just like today's celebrities. The idea that these old-fashioned values were somehow of value in historical eras but not today is probably false. In fact, in today's democratic societies, it is common to see people admired and even rewarded because of their outstanding personality traits, whereas in the past these may have been overlooked. So this paragraph has basically explained my reasoning and given two pieces of evidence: the ancient kings and queens and our modern tendency to reward attitudes of kindness that may once have been ignored. It's a strong argument that is quite convincing. Finally, for my conclusion, I would summarize this all. In conclusion, people have probably always worshipped others because of their social status and material possessions. The idea that we are now living in a vapid materialistic age is likely untrue. So what did we learn today? Hopefully you have not just found out what the most difficult IELTS question is, but rather why you need to read questions carefully and think before beginning writing. Although the examiners and test makers have no interest in tricking you, they are obviously trying to test your English and thinking skills, so this means they need to throw some difficult questions into the mix. Still, by reading beyond the keywords and avoiding assumptions, we can give ourselves the best chance of a high band score.